Welcome to the inaugural event of our Fall Colloquium series, which is on inequality and human rights. And there is being passed around a list of all of the talks in the series. They're basically every other week, every other Monday, with one exception. Naomi Klein is coming on a Wednesday. And the seminar, the colloquium, is the first part of a new project that the Rapoport Center is embarking on with a generous grant from the Ford Foundation on inequality and human rights. And it's a 5-year project. This is the very beginning of it, and in fact, this is our first event. So we're very glad that you could join us here today. I'll say that the Fall Speaker Series is also part of a colloquium that I'm teaching with law and LBJ students who are seated at these couple of tables and a little bit over there. And I'm doing it with the help of our postdoctoral fellow, Julia Dim, who should wave, who just joined us as a part of the Ford Foundation grant she was at Harvard at the Institute for Global Law and Policy, but she just completed her dissertation at the University of Melbourne on international environmental law and carbon offset schemes. And the class, the way it works is that we read materials by the speakers before they come, have a chance to discuss them, students write papers about them, and then after our guests speak, they get the first chance to ask questions, and then we open it up to the audience. And things work out well where we have a lot of time for discussion, as those of you who have been here before know. Today's event is entitled A New Greek Tragedy, Inequality, Human Rights, and Democracy. And it's co-sponsored by the Center for European Studies, for which we are grateful. And it features 3 people who are close to the law school. I'll introduce them to you all together at the beginning. The first speaker tonight, this afternoon, will be James Galbraith, who is a distinguished and well-known economist at our own LBJ school, where he is also the Lloyd Bentsen Chair, Lloyd M. Bentsen Jr. Chair in Government Business Relations and Professor of Government. He also directs the Inequality Project, which is particularly important for our thinking about inequality and human rights. He has a biography and a list of publications that would take me a very long time to recite, and since I'm only giving him half an hour, I'll let you hear from him. And I'll just say that what's probably most important for the background for his talk today is that from February through July of this past year, he served as informal advisor to Yanis Varoufakis, who was the Greek finance minister during that time. He'll speak for about 30 minutes about this summer's events in Greece and tying them to inequality between various states in the European Union as well as democracy. Philomila Tsoukala and Alvaro Santos will then respond from 2 different perspectives for about 15 minutes each. They're both professors at Georgetown Law Center and are both on sabbatical in Mexico this fall, which is where they came from, and they also both spent a great amount of the summer in Greece, and they do travel together. It's really a special treat to have them here because they've also both taught at UT Law School. It's hard to believe it was about a decade ago, in a program we then called the Emerging Scholars Program, and they emerged. So they contributed greatly to the law school while they were here, and they've gone on to do great things at Georgetown. And I'll say a quick word about each of them. Philomila Tsoukala, you might guess from the name, is from Greece. She's a family law scholar, and her research focuses on the comparative position of family law in the political economy of liberal states, and that includes Greece. Her most recent work, around which many of her comments today will center, is entitled Household Regulation and European Integration, The Family Portrait of a Crisis, and it's forthcoming in the American Journal of Comparative Law, and challenges policymakers and critics alike to pay attention to what's happening in the family in Greece. And then Alvaro Santos, who is originally from Mexico, teaches and writes in the areas of international trade, law and economic development, and transnational labor law. He's authored and edited a number of articles and book chapters in those areas, and I think he'll comment on the Greek crisis today largely from the perspective of law and development. And for class, we read the introduction to a book he co-edited entitled The New Law in Economic Development, A Critical Appraisal, which was from 2006. So a lot of what we're interested in is how relevant is it today, given what happened in 2008 and beyond. So with no further ado, I will have Professor Galbraith speak to us. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks very much, Karen. And it is really a pleasure to be here and an honor to be the speaker at the opening session of this seminar this year. I was just upstairs with a small group talking about inequality, and in particular about a data project that I've been engaged on with my students, including Jae-hee Choi, who's here, for quite a number of years, which has been an effort to make sense out of a very large, very inchoate, difficult to interpret body of information about the measurement of income inequality around the world over the past 40 or 50 years. And toward the end of what was essentially a very detail-oriented data presentation, I got a big question. And the question was roughly, what does it all mean? Which forced me to do something which is quite unaccustomed, which is to think. And the answer I came up with was that to the extent that there is and I think it's a pretty clear extent, that there is a perceptible pattern in the movement of measurable income inequality, economic inequality around the world, a common pattern. And to the extent that that pattern can be linked to something that we know of and that's familiar, that thing is financial power. That the dominant force, not the only force, but the dominant force that drives the movement of measurable inequality is the ebb and flow of relationships between creditors and debtors in the world economy. And it shows up particularly clearly at the world scale if you look at the great transitions of financial governance that occurred over the last 40 years, in particular the breakdown of a stabilizing framework that persisted from the late 40s through 1971, the Bretton Woods institutions. The period that immediately followed was one of a substantial credit boom in much of the world that actually reduced inequalities in many developing countries, which had rapid growth and high commodity prices for a time, and then a great reversal in 1980 with 1980-81 when the interest rates went up from zero or negative in real terms to around 20% for many parts of the world, throwing regions of the world one after another into deep depressions, which produced, not surprisingly, very marked and very easily observed increases in inequality, initially in Latin America and Africa, and then in Central and Eastern Europe, and as the Soviet Union crumbled partly under this pressure, and ultimately in the 1990s in Asia. So this is a pattern that was observed can be observed in the data, and tells you something about the power of financial forces and creditor-debtor relations in the way it affects social structures and people's lives at the global scale. So then it occurred to me that it would be useful to begin this talk by dwelling for a few minutes on how these relationships played out in the particular context of Europe in the late 1990s and into the 2000s with the creation of the single currency of the Eurozone, which had the effect at the end of this actual period of rising inequality in the world economy of giving credit expansion in certain parts of the European sphere a lease on life that continued for quite a few further years. And in particular, what happened was the European countries, having driven in part by political considerations, and in part by commercial and corporate pressures, which had to do with the fact that having 28 different currencies was a business that created a lot of financial instability and a lot of uncertainty in the profitability of transnational corporate operations. At least 19 of those countries got together and cemented themselves into a monetary union, eliminating all exchange rate fluctuations. And what then happened was that in countries which had previously had to charge very high interest rates to offset the expected depreciation of their currencies, that expected depreciation went away and the interest rates came down and converged into the introduction of the euro to a common and extremely low level, creating for the first time transnational credit markets that not for the first time, but on a scale that had not previously existed. And that had ramifications around the periphery of Europe, not so much in the central countries, but around the periphery, taking different forms. Notably, for example, in Ireland, there was a massive boom in commercial real estate development. In Spain, it was mainly in residential construction. That's to say, the 3% mortgage came to Spain, and many people took advantage of it, both natives and foreigners. And you had a massive burst of housing construction, which carried Spain to a height of prosperity, but very temporary prosperity for a certain period of time, brought down a very high unemployment rate. Of the countries that were affected by this, the weakest institutional case by far was Greece. What happened in Greece was not so much an extension of loans to the private sector, but an extension of loans from the banking sectors of North Europe, the French banks, and particularly the German banks, to the Greek state, to the Greek public sector. And this was to finance a great many things, including infrastructure projects. A very nice subway in Athens got built as a result of this. The Olympics in 2004 were part of it. It also financed to a massive degree the purchase by the Greek military, which is one of the largest, maybe the largest in proportion to GDP in Europe, of military equipment, submarines and tanks from Germany, jet fighters, including from France. And it also subsidized deficits that were cleverly obscured in certain parts of the Greek social structure, including the health sector. So you had a state which could and did take advantage of extension of credit on very favorable terms for all kinds of projects, very few of whom had any hope of actually paying their own way back, even under favorable conditions. These were projects that would have to be, if they were going to be repaid at all, would have to be repaid out of the general tax capacity of the Greek state. And they were, of course, in many cases corrupt. Greece never had and does not have a modern state. It has been run by alternating oligarchies, and in the period up before 2007, it was being run by a class of people very closely associated with the wealthiest citizens and the biggest tax evaders in the country. And so you had no impetus to create conditions under which these loans would become successful. It was very much a disaster waiting to happen. And what happened was a world financial crisis. A world financial crisis which originated in the United States, of course, with the calamity of unregulated, desupervised banking practices that led to the explosion of subprime mortgages, which were securitized and sold in many cases, to European investors, to banks, municipalities, pension funds, and so forth, on the presumption that these were as safe as U.S. government treasury bonds, AAA ratings from Moody's and Standard & Poor's. And in August of 2007, it became clear to the world that this was probably not exactly the case. And what happened at that point was, let's say, the beginning of a global flight of vulnerable investors from these overextended lending operations, which had been going on in many parts, well, especially in the European periphery, within the Eurozone. So you had a crash in Ireland, you had a crash in Spain, and you had a collapse of the access of the Greek state to credit markets, which became particularly profound when, as somehow tends to happen in the middle of these crises, at the end of 2009, the Greek electorate threw the conservatives out and elected the returned PASOK, the party of the Papandreous, to power, and they discovered, as they got into office, that in fact the finances of the state were far worse than had been advertised before the election. So in 2010, the Greek state was bankrupt. The Greek state was bankrupt. It could not pay what it owed, and it was forced to either have to default, which would have grave repercussions for the financial system, and was something which the United States was deeply opposed to. Secretary Geithner warned the European partners that a default by Greece would lead to severe consequences for American banks that had assumed the risk by issuing credit default swaps. And it would have had severe consequences for the banking system of Greece, some of which was owned by French banks, and for the French banks directly, and also for the German banks. And so there was arranged what was called a bailout. And it was indeed a bailout. It was a bailout, but the question is a bailout of whom? It was a bailout primarily of the French and the German banks, the French banks to a certain degree more than the German ones. The participants in the bailout were the IMF, then being led by a gentleman by the name of Dominic Strauss-Kahn. I don't know if you know what happened to him since, but he was a figure of unquestioned probity. And Dominic Strauss-Kahn used the IMF to further his presidential ambitions in France by moving the IMF into participation at a rate larger than ever before in the IMF's history, 32 times Greece's quota, and not to do anything for Greece or to save the world, but because this would ingratiate him with the French banking sector. The president of the European Central Bank was also a banker-connected Frenchman by the name of Jean-Claude Trichet. He similarly abused the power of his institution, doing something called the Securities Market Program, which propped up the price of these worthless Greek bonds. And the governments of France and Germany, the government of France, which was President Sarkozy, and the finance minister, who was an ambitious French politician named Christine Lagarde, I don't know what became of her, along with the German chancellors, then and now Angela Merkel, agreed to a package which basically forced the taxpayers of the European Union, not just the Eurozone, but of the whole Union, to take a share of the Greek debts. And I guess it was initially the Eurozone, and then later on some of the participation elsewhere as well. So what happened was that the burden of the Greek debt was transferred from the private sector onto the public sector, both the international public sector through the IMF, against the recommendation of a certain number of the executive directors of the IMF, including the Argentine and the Chinese directors, as well as warnings from the staff that that this was did not meet the IMF's criteria for debt sustainability, and onto the backs of the European taxpayers as well, including taxpayers from places like Slovakia and the Baltics, who are where the population is substantially less wealthy than the Greeks are on average. The Greeks, in order to facilitate this transfer of their debt and to rescue the banks rather than themselves, since they didn't get any money out of it to speak of, had to agree to terms and conditions that were dictated from the creditor institutions, which included the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission, the so-called Troika. This was a memorandum of understanding which imposed a policy regime on Greece of, let's just call it radical economic change, massive cuts in public expenditure, the firing of about 300,000 public servants, increases in taxes, cuts in pensions that were on the order of 44 to 49% on average, even before what happened this year, and a whole range of targeted privatizations and other steps that were intended to so-called liberalize the Greek economy. Those programs were officially projected, although I doubt that anybody believed the projection, that they would cost Greece 5% of GDP in 2011, and that there would be a recovery, 2012, 2013, things would be back to normal by 2 years ago. What actually happened in Greece as a result of the adjustment that was imposed, which was on the order of about 15% of GDP, was that the economy collapsed under the strain. And Greek GDP continued to decline until it reached a level about 25 to 30% below what it had been in 2009. That is a substantial, that's a decline on the scale of the worst of the Great Depression in the United States from 1930 to 1933, but with no recovery following, and no signs of recovery no serious signs as of 2014. So a vast, one of the greatest forecast errors, certainly in the history of the international financial institutions. And as the Greek state and the Greek economy collapsed, and this led to an unemployment rate on the order of 25 to 30%, about 60% for young people, complete collapse of private investment, massive bankruptcies in the private sector, as well as deep stress on the public health system, on the education system, on immigration of professionals. The universities essentially collapsed. That's how I got Yanis Varoufakis to come to Texas, was that his PhD program ran out of money. And so you could basically have your pick of the talented professional classes of Greece. The political system naturally also melted down. Papandreou was forced to resign over an abortive effort to schedule a referendum on the policies. He was replaced by a technocrat, Lucas Papademos, who didn't last all that long. Elections were held. Antonio Samaras came in, and his government collapsed under the pressure in 2014, at which time something very interesting and in many ways quite miraculous occurred, which was the rise not of, there was certainly a rising far-right, indeed Nazi party in Greece, but that was superseded after 2013 or so by something else, a force which had never before held power in the country and which offered a coherent and well-articulated alternative to the referendum policies, and that was Syriza, the party of a coalition of the parties of the radical left, led by a young man named Alexis Tsipras, who made his first, I think, appearance in the United States here in Austin in 2013 in November. Some of you may have come to see him. That appearance was arranged by visiting Professor Yanis Varoufakis and myself. In December of 2014, Syriza was able to, basically as a result of a quirk of the Greek constitution, to block the selection by parliament of a president, which then forced elections, which Syriza won on January 26th. Yanis resigned his position here in early January, was enrolled as a candidate for parliament, won the largest plurality of any candidate in the Greek elections, and took office as finance minister on the 26th of January, at which point I got an email that said, "Get here as soon as you can." Let me talk a little bit, 12 more minutes, about the Greek negotiating position and what happened since. There had been, over the period before the election, a discussion of something called the modest proposal, which was embedded to a certain degree in the Greek government's, in the Syriza plans, which was an attempt to reform all of Europe, to begin discussions about basically creating a stabilizing and sustainable economic model for the Eurozone. This would have involved mutualization of the debts of the crisis countries, in particular, reform and Europeanization of the banking system, and an investment program and a solidarity program to provide a kind of social insurance which presently doesn't exist across countries in Europe. That was essentially off the table from the very beginning of the new government, because neither the creditors were certainly not interested in discussing the problems of Europe. They were only interested in discussing the problems of Greece. And when you're as deeply in debt as the government was, with payment deadlines coming up, which had been planted there as kind of big landmines across the path of the new government, in a very short order, you had no choice but to negotiate the terms of the financial assistance agreement that already existed. And so that's what the Greek government set out to do. Yanis and I flew with Alexis to Brussels on, I think, the 12th of February as part of a team to begin these negotiations. And there were basically 4 points that we were trying to raise, leaving aside the question of the debt itself, which was going to come a little bit later. The 4 points had to do, first of all, with the structure of Greek labor markets, where part of the memorandum had basically destroyed the functioning of collective bargaining in Greece, reduced minimum wages, and created a very one-sided system, which was intended to and did reduce wages, but didn't produce any jobs. Didn't produce jobs because basically what happened was employers raised their profit margins, and nothing happened on the employment side. There was no demand, so jobs were not created. Second thing had to do with pensions, and I already mentioned that in the memorandum that was implemented after 2010, pensions were reduced to about half of, a little bit more than half of what they had been before. Maximum pension was in the order of €1,200 a month. Minimums were on the order of 300, 350 euros a month, which is not a lot of money. It's on the order of 10 or 11 per day. And the memorandum was demanding additional cuts on the order of about a third from those lowest levels of pensions. The government's position was that they were not going to cut the pensions of the most vulnerable, frail, elderly people in Greece who were living on these rather pathetic sums. Third point had to do with privatization, where the Greek government took the view, it was actually a left-wing government, it was not a pro-privatization government, but rather than oppose privatizations outright, it took a simply pragmatic position that if you put everything on the auction block at the same time, you don't get a good price. And so this is a dumb thing to do, and you shouldn't do it. And in fact, you could see this, that what was supposed to yield 20 billion was yielding on the order of $500 million a year. This was a very ineffective and a dysfunctional system that had been put in place, and they basically proposed to do a number of things, including having state participation, retain an equity share, and so forth, so that the government might enjoy some of the upside if, in fact, the private sector could manage things like ports and airports more effectively over time than the state was doing before. And the fourth area had to do with the overall macro posture of the government. Nobody believed, absolutely nobody believed in the targets that had been imposed on Greece, which were to maintain a primary surplus, which is the difference between government spending and taxes without counting net interest payments as part of expenditure, of 4.5% of GDP, something that's very high by the historical standards of any country, but certainly unobtainable in the Greek case. And our estimate was that every time you added a point to the primary surplus target, you got a point taken off of GDP as a penalty for it. Now, people dispute that, but that was basically the slide rule calculation that we'd made. It was clearly a highly recessionary target, but one that was also like setting up the government to fail. If you didn't meet the target, then you would be obliged to take yet further recessionary measures, raising taxes and cutting public expenditure. So we were arguing that this should be, in the context of debt renegotiation, this should be down to 0.5% or 1% of GDP at the most. We were not arguing for a Keynesian policy or expansionary policy, but to reduce the amount of pressure on the state budget for interest payments as far as possible. How far did we get with these positions, which I don't think anybody could argue on the merits? Were wrong. Everybody, I think, had to concede that on those 4 points, the Greek government had a very strong case. The answer is we got nowhere at all. We got an extension of the negotiation framework from the 20th of February to the 30th of June, and that was it. Once the Greek teams were in negotiations, and I was in the back room initially, but I wasn't really part of it. I was never at the table. They found that they were opposed all across the European spectrum. East Europeans and the Baltics, the Slovaks and the Finns in particular, were opposed on ideological grounds, and in the Finnish case partly because Finland, having adopted the euro, has done worse than any other Scandinavian country, and so it's threatened actually by a right-wing populist party. But they had at least a conviction on their side that their policies, which are extreme free market policies, were the correct ones, and they didn't want to concede another possibility for Greece. In the case of Spain, Portugal, or Ireland, where countries were in situations similar to Greece, the governments, still right-wing governments, were opposed to making any concessions that might encourage left-wing movements in their own countries. Podemos, Livre, Sinn Féin, that was their consideration, had nothing to do with Greece whatsoever, but that made them extremely hostile. The European Central Bank was unwilling to negotiate with any debtor. The European Central Bank is now kind of a monolithic authority of its own, and the fact that the Greek government was treating it as an equal was an inexcusable impertinence. You just simply couldn't get over this. The notion that you would treat your banker with a degree, that degree of not disrespect, but on an equal plane, infuriated them. And they became, they pursued a policy basically of destabilizing the financial sector in Greece from January on through the end of June, raising the limits that the Greek banks could borrow through emergency by a few billion at a time in order to remind people that they could always revoke the limits and you'd better take your money out of the banks while you could, which of course people did. The IMF was conciliatory on the question of debt because it knew it should never have gotten into this program in the first place, but completely hardline on all the reforms, so-called reforms, and all the substantive policies because it imposes them everywhere and it cannot admit to change. France and Italy were sympathetic, and if it had been up to them, you could have had a deal, but France and Italy were cutting their own deals with Germany and unwilling to stick their necks out for Greece. And Germany was kind of masterminding, or at least supervising the whole scene. The government of Germany was actually the Greek government's best interlocutor, in spite of the surface dramatics of the Varoufakis-Schäuble interaction. I traveled with Yanis to meet Wolfgang Schäuble on the 8th of June. Extremely interesting, cordial meeting. It was clear that the two had a considerable amount of personal respect and perfectly professional relationship. But the German government couldn't concede anything at all, and Schäuble was extremely clear about that. What we sought to do, what the Greek government sought to do, was I identify a little bit at this point with the, was to raise the negotiations to what was called the political level. And that meant to try and persuade the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, that it was in her interest to exercise leadership in Europe and to cut Greece some slack in order to consolidate Europe's position vis-a-vis the United States and with respect to Ukraine and Russia and other issues that were facing Europe as an entity. And we got some help from the U.S. government on that. I maintained very close links with Treasury, with the Federal Reserve, and eventually with the White House. The president made a number of telephone calls to Chancellor Merkel. It was encouraging. He was encouraging to Yanis, when they were Yanis was the only finance minister to meet President Obama in Washington when the fund bank meetings were held in April, partly because by pure coincidence, Greek Independence Day reception was held that day in the White House. It was too beautiful. In any event, the president met the finance minister. They had 12 minutes of public conversation, and the presidential phrase that stuck in everyone's mind from that encounter was the president saying to the finance minister, "I know austerity sucks." In any event, the problem with the political level was that the U.S. didn't have a lot of leverage. If it did have leverage, it wasn't using very much of it. Treasury was also not terribly helpful, but also it's a two-edged sword because at the level of the German government, the choice was either you cut some slack to the Greek government or you try to destroy it. And ultimately, that's what Chancellor Merkel decided to do. She didn't want to deal with a left-wing government in Europe. She had gotten rid of several previous left-wing governments. Certainly the Papandreou government in Greece was an example. Also Berlusconi, not left-wing government, but obstreperous government in Italy, had gotten rid of, and they figured they could do the same with Syriza. And so no concessions were made, and what the European negotiating strategy amounted to was a slow ride to disaster. The Greeks eventually made a fatal concession early on, actually, on the primary surplus. They said, we'll take 3.5 if we can't get 4.5. 3.5 is just as unattainable as 4.5, and rather constrain the Greek negotiating team into thinking about which pensioners do you execute, which civil servants do you fire, and so forth, rather than arguing on the merits of those policies. So it kind of locked them into the austerity mode. And the Greek government, as a sign of good faith, continued to make debt payments. They made $3.5 billion euro worth of debt payments over this period, which basically depleted the reserves of the Greek state as they moved toward the deadline of June 30th for the exhaustion of the ending of the program. With that meant they had to drain reserves from the hospitals, from the universities, from local governments, so that basically they were defaulting internally to suppliers and only maintaining any cash in the central account as a result of that fact. And then the program deadline came up on the 30th of June. The extension ran out. And just as that happened, Alexis Tsipras in Brussels finally decided he really had to make a stand, which is what he did by calling the referendum that was held on the 5th of July. And the story of that, of course, I imagine is known to you. The Greek government thought they were going to lose the referendum. They thought that the Greek voters, intimidated by a massive media campaign and by a political campaign, every politician in Europe was saying, you vote no and you're out of the euro, right? Basically dictating to the Greek people a false narrative of what was going to happen. The Greek government's position was that a no vote would help them negotiate. The government made very little effort in the referendum, but the people stood up in a very brave way and voted 61.5% no. I was in Athens for the last rally and for the vote. It was extraordinary. Also extraordinary to see the effect on the government, which was unprepared for it. Yanis went to see Alexis the night of the referendum and said we should stand up with the people. And the next morning, he clear that this was not going to be what would happen. Yanis Varoufakis resigned as finance minister. And in a few days, Alexis in Brussels again was browbeaten into accepting a complete capitulation to a new memorandum of understanding, which is just as bad and in fact some ways considerably worse than the previous one. Just as bad, but with some additional humiliating and punitive features, including full-time, basically nonstop reviews, which means the Greek government can do nothing on its own initiative, and a provision basically that everything that comes before the parliament, and even before it goes to public comment, has to be vetted and approved by the creditors. So Greece is no longer an independent country. It's an unprotected protectorate. It's a protectorate that exists now for essentially, if I'm right as an economist, for the liquidation of its assets, both its public assets and its private assets. Private assets via bankruptcy and foreclosure, public assets via privatization, will be sold off as rapidly as the situation allows, unless there is another political upheaval that brings this to an end. And that will not happen anytime soon. Of course, what then happened was that Syriza split. The 23, I think, deputies left to form another party, Popular Unity, which initially rose up to about 10% in the polls and then faded away. Did not make the 3% threshold in the elections. And as you know, what happened in the elections was a repeat of what had happened in January. Syriza went down for only 4 seats, from 149 to 145. Their coalition partner, the Independent Greeks, lost, 5 seats or so, and they ended up with just 2 seats, I guess. So they ended up with a 155-seat coalition rather than 162. And that is because Syriza does not have any internal dissidents left. That's likely to be a stable government for a substantial period of time, oddly enough. A stable government in an essentially colonial setting. What will happen next will depend upon what the Greek people decide to make of this and when they decide that they can't stand it any longer. I think there's a real contest going on between deep depression and a sense of defeat, and a latent rebellion, which could take any number of forms, and that could also emerge anywhere else in Europe, practically at any time. It may emerge on the left. That's probably less likely than we thought in the spring. Podemos is probably not going to win in Spain, but it could emerge in some other form, including you saw the Catalan results yesterday. It could emerge in a right-wing revolt against the European membership in Britain, and ultimately could emerge with a victory of Marine Le Pen and the National Front, basically the fascist party in France. So the European situation, I think, as a whole remains extremely unstable, and a real reflection of the, let's say, the ideological rigidity and structural weaknesses of the architecture of Europe and the Eurozone. Thanks very much.
On that optimistic note, breathe in, breathe out. So thank you very much for this talk. What I'm going to do is I will backtrack a little bit and provide for you a little bit of a more micro perspective on what happened in Greece. I happen to agree with most of what Professor Galbraith described in terms of how Greece got to where it is. Maybe a few asterisks here and there, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. But I think I'll spend some of my time just giving you a little bit of background on what things look like on the ground. And the ground in Greece is, it usually has to do with the family and households organized around the family. So the paper that your students read describes some of what I'm going to talk about here for everybody's interest. So it's really trying to, in the paper, I'm trying to combine, the macro perspective of here you have a country that is in most of its characteristics actually a developing economy rather than a developed economy at the moment in time when it starts integrating into European markets. And so that's the background of my discussion. And I try to put the macro background together with the micro background, which is what is happening, again, on the ground, which is the Greek family. Why am I arguing that that's the ground? Well, if you take a look at the Greek economy, actually 95% of it is essentially micro businesses of no more than 4 or 5 people, family-owned, family-operated. Most of them are not even operating under any formal kind of corporate law, right? Like most of them are just, personally, closely held businesses in the name of one member of the family. Usually, this in the 80s, this would be the father/husband. And if there is any formal legal framework for their operation, that would only be at the end of a spousal relationship, and like divorce laws basically might be something that might end up affecting how they operate. So a little bit of background. From Greece starts integrating into the European markets in 1981 is when we acceded to the European Economic Community, which then became the European Union. At that moment in time, there was quite a bit of agriculture. About 20% of the economy was based on agriculture. There was a bit of small-time manufacturing, textiles, shoes, stuff like that. And then there was tourism, right? Like that was already like one of the big drivers of the Greek economy. And all of it, of course, is highly inefficient as compared to other countries that are doing, some of the same stuff. And Greece in 81 enters the European Economic Community, and the idea there is that we're gonna open up, and that means we compete. So in 1981, the Greek unemployment rate was actually close to 3%. By 1984, it had skyrocketed to up to 9%. So that's also the moment in time when compensating money starts flowing in from the European Economic Community to Greece. Later, it would, Spain and Portugal would take similar paths, and some of that money is a lot of that money is put into big infrastructure projects, which initially, of course, are dissipated and become privatized through the mechanisms of corruption. So, and that keeps happening even later on with the Europe. So, the Olympics, nobody has actually. The budget for the Olympics was supposed to be something like 3 billion. I think it ended it's now calculated closer to 20 billion. And nobody has ever actually explained how we got there and where that money went. So, so the macro background, you are integrating an economy that's based on small-time manufacturing, agriculture, and tourism, and a microstructure of family-owned businesses, highly inefficient, into into the context of broader competition. The strategy that the Greek government took is not unlike strategies of other developing economies, which is, you can either make big structural reforms or try and, just wing it in some way or another. The Greek government tried to wing it. The strategy that was chosen in order to be able to wing it and allow people to survive in that context, in fact, had to do with the choice of we're going to reinforce the family as the main source of both welfare and employment. So we're not going to restructure the state so that the state takes on some basic welfare mechanisms, such as providing, universal healthcare or housing. That may have existed at some moment in time on paper starting in the 90s, but in the 80s, we're still talking about a state that doesn't have basic welfare mechanisms. The family is the basic welfare mechanism and the main mechanism for providing employment as well, and it continues to do so. And the way that the state allows this to go on and in fact solidifies it is through creating legal incentives for reinforcing the family in a variety of different domains. So, for example, labor laws. You have a family-owned businesses, doesn't matter, you don't need to apply labor law, right? So you can, your spouse can be your employee, and you can actually choose whether you're gonna pay Social Security contributions for them, even if they are working as your employee. You know, maybe you want to, maybe you don't, because you are redistributing to them supposedly through the profit that the business is making. So you get to choose, right? So informality is, in fact, a strategy that the Greek state adopts in order to allow these businesses to create. Tax evasion, it's part of the same strategy, right? It's not just, we're not just talking about you have a weak state which you did that doesn't necessarily have the means to enforce its legal framework. You have a state that realizes that if it were to enforce its legal framework, it would be dealing with even more massive unemployment than it has on its hands. So these micro businesses, family-owned, family-operated, can only provide, perform the work of being the main welfare provider through redistribution or the main employment provider through work in the family business, if they operate in this gray zone between formality and informality. And so, and that, I could go through an array of different domains that also includes family law, right? So, there's the legal framework changed in 1984. The idea was the idea was we need formal equality, which we didn't have up until that time. And supposedly the divorce laws changed so that they allow, spouses who have contributed to the increase of the other spouse's wealth to get a stake in that at divorce. In the US, if you get a divorce, everybody knows that a divorce is a very costly business for closely held businesses, precisely because the framework takes into account spousal contributions, and many times divorces end up in businesses splitting up, basically. Formally, the Greek state gave some stake to spouses. Informally, when it came to judges applying that framework, everybody understood that, if you in fact actually allow divorcing spouses to take some of the family capital with them, that would keep the family from being able to perform the function that it was performing. You would be splitting up family capital, and you would be creating dispossessed people who are now newly unemployed. So the judges, in fact, were very stingy with divorcing spouses. On the books, you may have a stake. In reality, divorcing spouses were actually given close to nothing in terms of the stake in a business. So everything, like the legal framework, basically consolidates the family as that main mechanism for providing welfare and unemployment. And so, you get, so that's throughout the 80s and the 90s. Then you get the euro, you get what Professor Galbraith described as a credit boom. And, there you see people being able to have access to more consumer goods. All of a sudden, you would be walking outside a bank in Greece, and people would be offering you loans so that you could take vacations. There were there was a credit boom. You could see it. You could see it all around, but still the state continued. Right, like this, the basic mechanism was the household, and it was the family. It was the main mechanism for allowing people to get by in an increasingly competitive economy where Greece didn't, in fact, have much of a comparative advantage in anything. So, fast forward, credit boom, credit bust. So that's all over, and along come the successive memoranda, right? So you have a situation whereby both it seemed to me the description of what was going on in Greece was, wildly irrelevant with what the actual situation on the ground looked on the economy. The prescriptions were also, in my mind, highly ideological. So the labor market reforms, I think that the labor market reforms were relevant to, again, a tiny segment of the labor market, the 5%. That was even obliged to be applying any of the labor law that was in the books. We changed that already in 2010. In fact, that was a question mark for me in these negotiations. Like, why are the labor market reforms still on the agenda? I mean, they are basically the requirement was there to change it from the beginning. It got changed. In my mind, it was irrelevant. It was not gonna, as it didn't create any jobs. And so that just gives you a little bit more of a background on, how an economy the microstructure of the economy basically made, besides the broader discussions of austerity versus, the global discussions on Keynes versus austerity, there was an underlying problem of this is a recipe that is just not well, a good fit for what the actual picture is on the ground. And Professor Galbraith described, the effect that the fiscal measures at least, had on the economy, but we're kind of on the same page, broadly speaking, about those. So I guess I will end by a series of questions that I think come from the point of view of seeing that, the question of labor market reforms, for example. The memoranda required certain things. Greece took certain reforms. The response of the Greek government was, let's backtrack on the labor. That's what they tried to get. Let's backtrack on the labor market reforms. Let's reestablish collective bargaining and minimum wages. And I agree, there's actually good also reasons to do that for the purposes of the global political project of not allowing global finance to wreak havoc in worker movements all around. But it seemed to me that in a society where the economy is structured this way, the project of just reestablishing collective bargaining is just going to be equally irrelevant as the project of disestablishing collective bargaining, for the reasons that it just doesn't concern much of the economy anyway, to begin with. That it's a project, that it's a bad match between what's going on in the ground and what's, prescribed in the papers. So the big question mark for me still to this day remains, what is a good progressive left project for an economy like Greece that has the characteristics of Greece, and what can the vision be for an economy like Greece within the broader European project? Can there be such a vision and such an alternative project? Because of course, we're talking about and the left has largely agreed to the idea of, okay, we need to, for example, informality is a bad thing. And it may be. But we need to be more open about the fact that when we're talking about people need to pay their labor contributions, we're talking about businesses closing, basically, because they are inefficient and they are basically just a mechanism for providing welfare and unemployment. They can't really compete in the open market. If from the left we agree that, formalizing the informality is a good thing, then we need to have a discussion about when all of these businesses go bust, what do we do with the people within them? And that's, I think, a question that neither the right nor the left has managed to answer. I have, of course, 10,000 questions for Professor Galbraith in regards to that negotiation and that what actually happened, but I will only pose one of them now, which would be, so what did if anything, if you could do the whole thing again, what would you do differently? So I'll stop here and give the word.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back in Austin and at UT. Thanks to Professor Engel for inviting me to be part of this panel, and congratulations on the Ford Foundation grant to do research and explore the relationship between human rights and inequality. So I'll divide my remarks in 4 parts. First, I will try to situate the current moment in the periodization that was outlined in the introduction to the book I co-edited and that was circulated. So basically, what do we make of the current set of policies that have been recommended by Europe to the European countries in the context of the development models that have been in vogue since World War II? In the second part, I will say some things about Professor Galbraith's account of the Greek crisis, and particularly raise some questions about that were triggered by his remarks. In the third part, I will talk a little bit about the relationship between human rights and austerity, particularly taking into account the other paper that was circulated, and so say something about what we can expect from this linkage between human rights and inequality, or how could it be used to resist austerity. And finally, I'll conclude with some questions to both Professor Galbraith and Professor Tsoukala. So, in the introduction that I circulated, my co-author David Trubeck and I were providing a map that basically started with World War II, talking about 3 moments of development theory and practice. And the first moment we associated with the developmental state and the policies of import substitution, industrialization. The second moment with neoliberalism and the policies of trade liberalization, privatization, fiscal discipline, and so on. And so we were speculating, and in fact thought that there was the emergence of a third moment that was basically a critique and a renunciation of the neoliberal model. And the question there was, is this really a new model, or is this just basically a tampering or what some scholars call chastened neoliberalism, or the enlightened Washington consensus, which was some relaxation of the neoliberal model, but basically pretty much the same. And so this was part of our question. And I think, given the evidence today, we were probably too optimistic in believing that there was, in fact, the formation of a new economic model that emerged from the critiques of the neoliberal model. And 3 reaction papers that were circulated today made that point. So by Audrey Graham and Pamela, basically saying the third moment has never arrived, or it's a mirage. We're very much in the second moment. And I think that was a surprise to me too, when I saw what was happening in Europe. So this introduction was written in 2006, and then with the financial crisis in 2008, it seemed that that was creating an opportunity to really make an important crack, or basically a displacement of the neoliberal model, because it had been very much a system that was based on assumptions of neoliberalism, both in the United States and elsewhere. And you had these mea culpas by people who had been prominent in exposing, or rather supporting that model. So remember Alan Greenspan's sort of coming to terms or contrition with what had happened. Closer to the legal academy, Richard Posner, one of the main exponents of, or founders of the law and economics movement, who had really been sort of propounding a view based on a neoclassical economic model, also was sort of saying we got it wrong. And so there seemed to be an opening both in theory and in policies that something new could come about. But then when you saw the response to the financial crisis, I think you had to think again about, whether that model really was displaced. And in fact, what you saw particularly in Europe was an entrenchment of some of the policies that had been tried in the structural adjustment years of the IMF and the international financial institutions in Latin America and Asia, and that many of us thought had been so criticized that had been discredited. So there was a lot of criticism to these policies that were tried in the 80s and 90s that look uncannily similar to the recommendations of the Troika to Greece and other countries in the southern periphery of Europe. And moreover, as Professor Tsoukala has argued, these policies are no longer just part of the package that's recommended to countries that have been bailed out, but they have been incorporated as part of the what's called the European semester, so basically economic policies recommended for countries all around Europe as part of sort of the European vision for growth. And so it's really puzzling to see basically this sort of back to the future, this idea that something that seemed to have been left beside is really back with a vengeance. And I don't have an answer to that, except to recognize that the third moment really isn't here, at least in Europe, and that it might be that this emergence of a new model or a new developmental state could be happening or pinpointed somewhere else. And so for a while it seemed like the emerging economies like the BRICS were pointing towards a new direction. China was definitely a big problem for the neoliberal model, and there was an effort to re-theorize or recover the experience of the East Asian tigers as an alternative to neoliberalism. But in the dominant discourse of today, at least in what respects to Europe, it seems like we are back in very, very important ways in the policies of structural adjustment. And it's a little bit ironic even to see that the IMF is playing the role of the good guy when it comes to the European austerity policy. So the IMF was vilified for being such a hardliner in the context of developing countries, and it seems like in Europe it's in some sense the institution that is playing the role of trying to soften up the medicine, at least by arguing for debt reduction for Greece. Okay, so let me move to the second part, and this is to talk a little bit about Professor Galbraith's experience, and I really loved your account of your experience being part of, being an advisor of Varoufakis and also being part of the negotiating team. And so I had a few questions. I also agree with your account of what happened with the leading up to the crisis and what got Greece in this terrible economic conundrum. Based on your paper as well, in the paper that you circulated, I was puzzled by what. So I wanted to ask you what you think explains the resilience of these economic policies. I agree with you. I mean, this is at least my own economic and political inclination. When you said that the objections that you had to the 4 recommendations of the bailout program, as Syriza got, were on the merits not objectionable. That is that everyone or almost everyone could agree on economic merits that these 4 recommendations were going to damage the Greek economy, and so that opposing them would be a good thing to do, not only for Greece but also for Europe. What do you think explains this incredible resilience of these ideas and the incredible opposition to them, to the Greek negotiating position? And you mentioned a variety of different possibilities, and so let me just mention 3, and I'm curious to see whether you think that either of these is more dominant. So one possibility is that the European technocrats and the dominant figures who are espousing these economic views are ideologues, and they believe what they propose, and they're basically, they've bought a dogma, and it's very hard to shake them out of it. A second possibility is that they're acting in bad faith, and so they have material interests that they dressed up as economic theory, but really they're pursuing a different objective. And then a third possibility is that they're willfully blind, that they somehow intuit that their economic theory and their assumptions are wrong or misguided, but they have high stakes in the continuation of these ideas because their careers depend on them, or they've put so much work into them that now it's very hard for them to recognize that they're wrong, or they will lose credibility. And so I wonder whether, in your experience being so close to the action, you had a sense of which of these 3, if any, or what combination was really driving this incredible resilience of the economic dogma. And so let me say one word about, or a little bit more of one word about the relationship between human rights and economic inequality. And this is basically based on that paper that was circulated too. My own position here, and this is something that was also in the introduction that I circulated, was that human rights could be a great way to articulate an opposition to an economic program like the austerity that's currently being proposed. And in fact, this was very much the argument in that article that, and I'm forgetting her name, it's Margot Salomon, the author, yeah, that basically the European institutions are not considering human rights in any of their recommendations, and there are so many ways in which the austerity policies violate human rights commitments of Europe. And so I think that that's an important argument, and it could be articulated in a variety of different ways, but it's also important to recognize that human rights don't have a determinate character and could also be used to, in fact, have been used to embolden or propose some of these very same austerity measures. So, for instance, Professor Tsoukala has shown how many of the new policies of austerity were in fact articulated in the name of social Europe. to protect the most vulnerable groups in Europe, to get rid of what were considered very rigid markers that were hurting growth and therefore basically hurting people who didn't have access to markets. And so that moving in the direction of these policies would actually be beneficial and consistent with human rights. And it's not a surprise. I mean, in some countries, labor flexibility has been advanced based on, and by this I mean sort of getting rid of protections for workers, has been advanced in the name of freedom of association in its negative aspect. So basically, the possibility for workers not to associate if they want, which has greatly undermined unions. And it's made based on this argument that there's a human right of freedom. And so you can see that human rights are multi-polar, and that you can't just basically place your faith in human rights and expect that an outcome that will be beneficial will follow, because they can't be they can be turned in different directions. Another quick example is the way in which investment rights have been established in some bilateral investment treaties or in investment chapters of trade agreements. There's a big debate in the United States recently in the context of the United States trade and investment agreement with Europe, TTIP, and another trade agreement with the Trans-Pacific countries, right? So the experience has been that the property rights, the investment rights of foreign investors could be given so much force that the regulation of countries for specific social purposes, like the environment or others, could be considered a regulatory taking that affects the property rights that could be considered human rights of investors. So these are just two examples to remind you that, yes, the human rights agenda is important, but it has to be really crafted in a way that makes, that takes into account economic arguments and looks at the policy consequences, that it can't be just a formal exercise on rights discourse. And so finally, I have some questions more questions for Professor Galbraith and Professor Tsoukala. So the two questions for both of you are, there's something missing in this account that Professor Galbraith gave about the leverage that Greece was trying to use moving at the political dimension, and that is it's flirting with Russia. And so it seemed to me that there was something there where it was constantly portrayed in the news as Tsipras is talking to Putin and he really wants to get Putin's backup, and I wonder, some of these might have been completely exaggerated. I wonder what the strategy was there, what the strategy was. What was Greece trying to get? What was the Greek government trying to get by this reapproachment? And what was its result? Because it seemed to have alienated Europe quite a bit, given the statements of some of the European technocrats. And then the second question for both is, I've heard you both say that the Greek politicians thought they would lose the referendum, and that they not Varoufakis, but Tsipras and maybe others actually wanted to lose the referendum because it'd be easier for them to save face and just agree to the terms of the memorandum. But it seems to me a puzzling position of the Greek government, given that they had been waiting for this moment, they had been preparing themselves for this moment, and Tsipras at least campaigned for the referendum, and he was invoking the moment where the Greek prime minister or president said no to Mussolini, so the big no in the Second World War. So it seemed like it was really invoking national history to resist the referendum, and all of a sudden the capitulation was a big turnaround. And so how do you explain that would be the second question. And finally, this question more specifically to Professor Galbraith. What do you see your role being going forward, given this experience? And I wanted to ask you for two reasons. One, because you participated in the as advisor of Syriza government, and particularly as advisor of Varoufakis, what do you see yourself doing to pursue the agenda you were pursuing now by other means? And I'm also asking this because you've been a big sort of researcher of economic inequality. As you said, you were just explaining to us this really great project that you've been building for quite some years at UT. And I wonder whether inequality could be a catalyst politically to advance a challenge to these neoliberal austerity policies in Europe and elsewhere, particularly given the recent political movements that have emerged also in the industrialized countries like Occupy Wall Street, the fast food living wage campaign, and in Europe, as you mentioned, Syriza and Podemos, but before that, Indignados in Spain. So it seems like there is quite a bit of fertile ground and a lot of social movements that are rallying around economic inequality. And given your position on this topic, it seems like it could be connected to the sort of broader political agenda on economic policy and development theory. Thanks.